Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us once again for our third Masterclass workshop series. Today, we're going to be talking about making community radio, which is going to be a roundtable discussion. I am Hina, and I'm the spoken word manager at CiTR, and I'll be facilitating this roundtable discussion today and also participating in the discussion. And if you've been attending this series, you're probably familiar with me now. And for those who don't know, CiTR is a campus and community radio station at University of British Columbia. So CiTR has partnered with the Community Arts Council of Vancouver to provide you with this very exciting workshop series happening online. We have 2 more to go, which is going to be the coming Tuesday and Thursday, same time, 7 p.m. So I hope you folks are able to attend those workshops as well. We will pop the link in the chat. A few housekeeping things before we begin. Please keep yourself muted throughout the workshop. This event has closed captioning, and you can enable that by clicking live transcript. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and you can ask your questions either by unmuting yourself and asking the question, or putting your question in the chat. This event will be recorded and later uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything or you want to go revisit, it's going to be there for eternity. And showing your video is encouraged, but you can go off camera if that's what's more comfortable. Okay, so before we begin, I'm going to say a brief land honoring, and I want everyone to take a moment and reflect on why it is important to do so and what it means to honor the lands we reside on, especially with what we're talking about today, being in community and audio storytelling in community. This workshop is taking place on the unceded, traditional, and shared territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations in the city colonially known as Vancouver. And we honor the historic and continual care of this land by our host nations. Media and art practices have traditionally been rooted in white gaze and colonial narratives. CiTR and Community Arts Council of Vancouver understand the power of sharing stories and our responsibility to do so ethically, as well as actively push for more equity in the community arts sector. With that, I will pass it on to Kristen, who's the Executive Director at Community Arts Council of Vancouver, to say a few words.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kristen Chung. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm the Executive Director here at CACV. Our mission is to further the development of community arts throughout Vancouver. And yeah, we've partnered with CiTR Discorder for the past few years as part of our Vancouver Outsider Arts Festival. And we're looking at new ways to kind of serve our shared community. And yeah, this workshop is just an expansion of our partnership. And so yeah, we're super stoked for this series. And yeah, really happy to have everyone join us. We also have a short survey at the end. So if you could fill out the survey and let us know how we can improve and your ideas for future workshops, that would be super. So I'll pass it back to Hina and Kleo and Randi. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, let's get started. So welcome to the roundtable on making community radio. I am joined today by 2 very talented CiTR programmers, Kleo and Randi. As I mentioned, I am Hina, and I've been the spoken word manager at CiTR for the past almost 3 years now. Wow, that's a while. In the radio sector, spoken word does not mean poetry. It means talk radio. I am also a writer, journalist, and audio producer interested in telling stories about culture, migration, gender, and social justice. I also host a radio show called This Is Not Fine on CiTR 101.9 FM. I'm going to pass it on to Randi to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. I'm Randi. I wear several hats at CiTR. I just can't get enough of it. So I have my longest standing project is I'm the lead for the Intersectionality Collective. So I've been that for 3 years. I also have my own radio show, which is called Dog-Eared Radio Book Club, which is a book club on the radio. And then I work on some side projects, and I recently got involved with some of the student leadership at the station, which has been very fulfilling and kind of allowed me to get more involved into like the backside of like the background of radio, and that's been really interesting.
Great. Kleo?
Sure. Hello, Kleo Skavinski Suje, Pendisakai Gotse Dene Ati. My name is Kleo Skavinski. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am Decho Dene from Treaty 11 territory, and I am the Indigenous Collective Lead at CiTR, and I have been since September. I've taken on the role from other amazing folks that came before me. The Indigenous Collective also is responsible for Unceded Airwaves, which is my weekly radio show that I host at CiTR. And yeah, I think that's my introduction. Back to Hina.
Awesome. So I did spend way too much time trying to come up with an appropriate structure for this discussion because radio itself is such a massive topic to tackle, and we need a few hours, if not more. And I think we were able to come up with a pretty good structure, if I say so myself. So what we're going to do, just so everyone has an idea and can follow along, is we're going to have our discussion in 3 segments. Can you tell that we all host a radio show? We will be taking the title Making Community Radio and deconstructing that. So we're going to be working backwards, which I've found in audio storytelling often is the way to go. And so we're going to be starting with radio, demystifying radio to be exact, and then talking about community, finding community. We'll hear from Kleo and Randi about that. And then we're going to be talking about making that darn show. So I will just talk about radio a little bit. What is radio? And demystifying radio. People tend to have a lot of misconceptions about radio. For example, like I think a big one I hear is, isn't radio dead? or like it's this inside baseball thing which only a few people have access to. And I wanted to start with talking about the distinction between radio and podcasting. And believe it or not, there is very little difference. And more the gap is being bridged. So radio will often have an FM license, and a podcast is purely distributed and consumed online. However, most radio shows are available online as well as through their website and even Spotify. So for example, talking about CiTR, most of our shows are on Spotify and iHeartRadio and are on our website, as well as we have our FM 101.9. So very similar to how you would consume a podcast. For radio, you will have certain mandates. So for example, you will have to play a set number of ads and PSAs, which you don't have to do for podcasting. And also sometimes fulfill requirement, for example, playing 35% CanCon, which is like playing 35% Canadian music. But then again, a lot of podcasts do incorporate ads because that's how you can make money. And for radio, you're often doing it live, whereas podcasts are pre-recorded. But again, having said that, since the pandemic, a lot of radio shows are pre-recorded, which is great because it's very accessible for a lot of folks. And so at CiTR, I'd say maybe it's more half and half now, where mostly our shows were live, but now a lot of programmers do their shows pre-recorded. And so in a nutshell, the 2 audio mediums are quite similar. And then something else I wanted to briefly touch upon is, what is the difference between community radio versus commercial radio versus campus radio? The 3 largest broadcast sectors in Canada are commercial and public, and then you've got your campus and community radio. So commercial would be anything you hear in your car. So some examples are The Peak, Rock 101, and then public is CBC, funded by taxpayers, or in the UK would be BBC. And campus and community radio station is us. CiTR has a campus-based community radio license, which is, we have a very unique sweet spot, I feel, which means that we serve the UBC community. So a lot of our volunteers are students. However, we also serve the Vancouver community at large. So we have legacy programmers who've been involved for decades. We have a lot of folks who are community members involved at the station. But CiTR is not the only one. There are other community radio stations as well. So you've got Vancouver Co-op Radio, you've got CJSF Radio out of SFU. And just generally, I feel radio is, community radio specifically, is low barrier, it's accessible, it's easy to get your foot in the door. You can literally just email the programmer, cold email them, and pitch your show. People are around to help you make radio. There's built-in support and yada yada. I could go on about my love for radio, but I'm not going to do that. But with that, I want to move on to talking about community and what that means and how do you find this community. And I want to pick Kleo and Randi's brain about it. So Kleo and Randi, you both run radio collectives at CiTR. Could you briefly talk about your collectives? And how about we start with you, Randi?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the Intersectionality Collective, which the show is Intersections. So Intersections is a bi-weekly radio show. We changed it recently to be 90 minutes. It is fully pre-recorded. And so that allows us to, I think, cover like more content that we typically wouldn't. We've also been able to reach like really awesome guests. We've interviewed profs from across the United States and across Canada, interviewed one person that was overseas. So a lot of opportunity there. As for how I run the collective, my main thing is the persistence. So because, as Hina mentioned, we are mainly comprised of student volunteers, we don't have like an amazing retention rate all the time with students, because especially in New Year's, they come in, they're freshmen, the first month is like super good and everybody's having fun. And then by the time midterm season, then everything kind of changes and it gets a little bit harder to manage their time. So I just try to be persistent, but also allowing volunteers to kind of give to the collective whatever they have. So if that's just, coming to a meeting once a month, participating in one episode a month, maybe it's just designing social media artwork, kind of like whatever they're able to do. I find that's really been good. As for how I approach running the collective, so I do have like a formed collective. I currently have about 9 members, I believe. And that's comprised of mostly student volunteers and then 1 community member. So I do take a pretty firm leadership role, just because it is, tough to wrangle 9 different people into what, comprising 1 episode. But I do split the work. So I try to allow the volunteers to play a role in the editing of the episodes, the questions for interviews, the actual interviews themselves. As I mentioned, designing artwork for social media. We design all of our own social media. So I'm mostly in the background. So I send emails so that all of our contact with guests is kept under 1 email. And I also have all of the social media accounts. I did make the mistake of sharing them, and I don't recommend doing that ever again. So I kind of look at it as like I'm playing like the leadership role, but it's like a backup role. So I'm allowing all of the volunteers to do their best work, contribute what they can, but I'm always there to catch them and to help them, because I do have more experience, and I think it's good to use the knowledge that you have to teach it to someone else. And then just very quickly, I wanted to go over like an actual doing like a collective episode, how to work together. So for an 2-episode series, which is typically what we do. We'll have a meeting, we discuss our topic. We usually pick who we're going to interview. So as I said, then I would contact all of these people, and then I allow our members to create their own discussion topics. And then we always like schedule recording together. So we're trying to make it so that everyone can participate, but also understanding that we all have different schedules. Yeah, and then as I mentioned, that background role, because we are, and because of their collective being what it is, intersectionality, we do sometimes touch on heavy topics. So I do take that like final approval. So I do all of the final editing for episodes. I think that's also important because sometimes we do get newer members in here, and it's good to have, you know, work as a collective to decide what we want to say about a topic, and so that we're not publishing content in episodes that go outside of what we believe attention, which I'll actually talk about later. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit about how I run the collective. Yeah, I really approach it as like I'm in this lead role, but it's kind of like I'm playing backup to a bunch of different amazing volunteers.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And Kleo, let's hear your approach on how you run your collective.
Yeah, so I'm the Indigenous Collective Lead. It's been around for a hot minute, I believe 2016, and it started as another Indigenous student's practicum project for their degree. I'm also a UBC student, and I'm studying some sociology and Indigenous studies, so I have a bunch of connections there. And my collective is not very volunteer-based. It's kind of like a central pillar that is myself, but also it's still very community founded in the way that I'm involved in a lot of Indigenous spaces around campus. And I'm always bringing up the radio and bringing up unceded airwaves and talking about like, oh, last week's episode, we talked about this with a certain person. So I also get a lot of suggestions from different Indigenous folks and also folks that are around the Indigenous communities around UBC and the wider Vancouver area. And that's where a lot of my greatest guests come from, is folks saying, hey, you should talk to so-and-so. They are an artist, or they're an author, or they're doing these great, amazing things, which is where the community foundation comes for me and who I make my show for. A lot of my shows are also pre-recorded, and I do this because a lot of people I'm speaking to are unable to meet me at the set time of broadcasting, but are also not in Vancouver. I've spoken to people all the way in Toronto. I've also spoken to people up in the Northwest Territories, where I'm from. I've had students, I've had professors and authors and artists, as well as my mother came on an episode once, which was a lot of fun to kind of show her what I was doing there. But my social media and everything is also run by me, but it's a lot of community engagement through all these different platforms, through emails and through the DMs. And like I had a very good episode recently with a professor who was creating a digital Indigenous metaverse game, which was so much fun. I love having these interviews. So a lot of my shows are interview based, not so discussion as Randi's is. But yeah, it's an absolute joy, which happens to be my theme. A big thing through the Indigenous Collective and Unceded Airwaves, that the lead always has a theme for their seasons. The previous season just before mine was Indigenous Futurisms, and mine is Indigenous Joy, and centering on the brilliance that is going on around us and what makes everyone kind of tick and feel really good, especially after experiencing a pandemic and whatever else is going on in people's lives. It's fun to bring in the good parts and the good conversations and the laughter. Yeah, that's what I do with my collective and Unceded Airwaves.
Amazing. Yeah, I just want to share with folks who are tuned in that something that I admire about you two, and it's very cool that you two have such different approaches to running your collective, and it just goes to show that there's so much there. You can tell audio storytelling is so vast, and you can do it in so many different ways, right? And you could yeah, that's the end, that's the end of my thought. I have another question on the note of community, is that often when you're pursuing pursuing your passion projects, it can be a lonely journey. And so how do you find / build community as an audio storyteller? If you folks have any tips on that, and some things that worked for you or didn't work for you.
I can go first. Something I find is when I first got into my role back in the fall this past year, I reached out to the person that had before me and I asked them for advice. And I asked, how did you do it? What worked, what didn't work? And that's really great to be able to rely on someone that has that experience, especially if you're coming in, or if you're coming in with other experiences and realizing, oh, I have a different skill set and different priorities, but my priorities should be informed with my audience, with my guests, and where I want this intention to be and who I want to be really impacted by this in a positive way. I find that's the thing with like being an audio storyteller is that we're always talking, especially us three. We can talk forever. Randi and Hina, we definitely have great conversations, and that's what I do in all my spaces. And I find that's what really grounds me in audio storytelling in the form of radio. Any thoughts, Randi?
Yeah, that is true for a long time. I think for me, as Hina mentioned, like Kleo's and I collective, they're quite different in the way that we approach them. I found like very good community in each year I've had different volunteers, and I think the community has just shifted in like what type of relationship I have with them. You know, I've made friends from the show, but I think for me, what really works is drawing from people's interests. People are more likely to stay committed to something if they're very interested in it. So something that they're passionate about. So this is why, like, when I mentioned, so we have discussion episodes and interview episodes, I really try to encourage them to pick discussion topics they're excited about. And I can see that come out. Like when we have discussion topics, I have to usually stick to timing very harshly because people get very into it and they'll do a lot of research and come up with some really awesome to share. As far as like through our interview guests, I do have a very cool story. So we did an episode last springtime, I believe, about anti-fatness. And we interviewed this really amazing PhD student who I'm actually blanking on her name, which is very sad because we're friends now. But anyways, we interviewed her and it was a great conversation. And I actually reached out to her after to get some just advice about school and stuff. And I ended up joining this really awesome team through her. So I think that's a really cool story of like how you can meet people that often seem intimidating, you know, like you email this quote unquote expert and then they come on your show and you interview them. And yeah, you're kind of putting them as like position of authority. But you can make some really awesome connections that go beyond like your radio show, which I think is awesome.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to slide into those DMs, and I mean it purely in a professional sense. And I just said quote unquote professional because it feels weird to use that word in like a community art sector because things are more casual, I suppose. But that has definitely worked for me. And someone at work described Instagram as LinkedIn for people working in the arts. And I thought that was very funny and very true. And so I have definitely, this comedian that I'm trying to interview, who's kind of big, I just cold DM'd them and I told him that I saw his stand-up and I thought he's really funny. And some of the sociopolitical themes that he has tackled, I would really like to have him on my show. And he responded. And you just have to be persistent. And then he forgot about it. And I was like, I haven't forgotten about you. So when can you come on my show? And also, don't forget to ask your guests for recommendations. And people love that. Just someone, I know Kleo has done that in their approach for making community radio is, oh, so your book was great. Who are some of the other people on your radar? And you know, that's kind of another way to really kind of get in the scene. with that, I'm going to move on. We're going to move on to making that darn show, as promised. And we have sort of a few guiding questions. I want to start with, and this is for the three of us, so I will answer my own question, but what are the 3 things to consider when starting a show? Maybe we can start with Randi. Oh, can you hear us, Randi?
You cut out for a second. Sorry.
Did you hear my question, or do you want me to repeat?
No, I did.
Okay.
I'll start. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have 3 things to consider when you're starting a show. So the first one is choosing the intention of your show, and Kleo did touch on this, I think, because obviously a lot of these themes and tips are very related, but choosing the intention of your show. So this is more than just what your show is about, it's what you want your show to do. So to speak to the 2 shows that I predominantly work on, Intersections, so our kind of intention is to educate the people who listen to the show on gender, race, sexuality, and social justice. So obviously that's super broad, but we want to encourage people to not be afraid of learning. As we learn with every single episode that we do, every interview that we record, every time we research for a discussion episode, we very much encourage self-learning. And the ways that we do this is by being very honest in our discussion episodes. We are very truthful about being I didn't know that. Yeah, having this approach to be that we're actually learning with the people who are listening to the show, which I think is really good. For Dog-Eared, my intention is just to create a book club on the radio because I thought that was amazing. I actually started a book club during COVID with a bunch of my family, and we're in Canada, so it just kind of got me into this idea of being you don't have to have a book club in your living room space with all the people in it. A book club can be whatever form you want. So my second thing is to surround yourself with supportive people. This doesn't mean surround yourself with yes people. It means that you just want to surround yourself with people that support your vision, and that will help you to execute it, to move towards. Obviously, community radio is a fantastic place to find like-minded, supportive people. That's why it exists. Okay, and my last one, which I think is the most important one, is to always be open to learning. So you'll learn something literally every time you do something community radio. Even though I've run Intersections for 3 years now, well, over 3 years, I am constantly changing my approach to an episode. I get tips all the time from new members, how they think things can change, and I'm always open to those suggestions. Yeah, every guest, every interview is a new experience. Even though you might have done 30 interviews, don't go into it expecting oh, I know everything. There's always something you can learn. Those are my 3 things that I suggest if you're going to start a show. I'll pass it over back to Hina.
Awesome. You sounded like you were in a radio show. That was very articulate. Definitely, I agree with Randi on being open to learning. I know sometimes there is this fear and this expectation that you have to be an expert, and you don't have to be. That's the beauty of making radio and audio storytelling and podcasting, and just generally any form of storytelling, is that you grow and learn every day, and that's what keeps it exciting. So yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that. But my 3 things will be, so the first one is, who's the show for? Consider your audience. And these are definitely lessons that I learned when creating my own show. A lot of advice that I give to volunteers or collectives that I supervise. We also have just a plug that we have other collectives as well, other than Indigenous and Intersectionality. We've got Accessibility Collective and Arts, Music, Sports, and News. And this is going to help you in the long run if you have an imaginary audience. What do you think they would want to hear? Why do you want to share an interview or a segment with them? What kind of audience are you cultivating? So lots of questions will, just asking yourself a lot of questions will definitely, again, benefit you in the long run, because then you don't want to be stumbling as your show is sort of like live, as your show is out in the world, right? You have to have all these questions answered beforehand. And even when you're doing your episode, like just thinking of like, oh, is this clear to my audience? But of course not over explaining or spoon feeding them. And what is happening on air? Who are you? Do they have a clear idea of who you are and why you're talking to them? And then what is your show, right? The ultimate existential question. And then for my second one is, and I know not to sound like that annoying editor and producer, but they're right. Why should people care, right? There are a bajillion podcasts in the world, and just think about your show identity. And this is something that I definitely went down the rabbit hole with my show. So I'll just talk a little bit about This Is Not Fine. When I was creating in the process of developing the show, and I talked a lot with our programming manager, Jasper, I really obsessed on the title. I wanted it to be the funniest title and the catchiest title, and just like, just like very cheeky, but it wasn't helpful because I didn't even know what my show was about, right? And so I had this great title, and then I was trying to make a show about like following that title, but that was not a good approach. And so just going back to why should people care and thinking about your show identity, I thought of what I want my show to be about, and I can read the little description I have is, it's a show about everything that is not fine. I often joke that I'm a certified hater, and I wanted to do that, but in an informed way. And so my sort of elevator pitch for the show is, tune in for your healthy dose of rage about culture, media, society, and the internet, featuring cool music. So that brings me to the next point of why should people care is, you should be able to describe your show in one line and have an elevator pitch. And this is something that I workshop with friends who have no background in radio, and that's often helpful. When I was trying to explain them my show previously with the other idea, they actually were like, oh, I don't know, like I'm confused. And I was like, oh, okay, that's good. So this is not working. And then thinking of like, why is your show unique? And as a host, just find what makes you comfortable and be able to be consistent with it, rather than sometimes we think we want to talk about this, but then that's actually not your interest. And then you find it the hard way. And then, of course, work backwards from there to come up with the title. And so, because title is important, right? That's kind of people's like one-stop shop, and that's their entryway, but really nailing down your one-liner. And then my last one is, how are you going to make an engaging show? So considering your show structure is so important. Like, I cannot emphasize on that enough. What is your show format? So is it an interview show? Is it a roundtable? Is it a panel? Is it a performance show? Is it narrative-driven storytelling? And then how long is your show? So is it a limited series? Are there seasons? So as Kleo mentioned, with unceded airwaves, they have seasons. And how often? Because it's always good to be predictable, so your audience knows when to expect your show, and they like that. Reliability. So are you airing your show weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? So those are my 3 things. Kleo, what are your 3 things?
What are my 3 things? So I'm relatively new compared to my co-hosts over here, who also are low-key my mentors in my journey through radio the past few months. I definitely go to them like, I don't know what to do with this. And so my first thing about starting a show is don't be afraid to ask for help, especially if it's like things are like, oh, the editing went weird. Go, there's people, they will know something, or they will help you Google it. Or even just saying, oh, I don't know how to structure this interview in a way that makes sense or feels right to me. And people definitely have some thoughts to share with you, especially how Randi had brought up earlier, not to surround yourself with yes people. You need people that are willing to give you the truth in a way that is digestible. So definitely being open to asking for help and taking those constructive criticisms and those insights, because if you're creating your show, you're probably planning it out, you're probably recording it or going live. But if you're recording it, then you're editing it and then it goes out. So you've heard it a couple times, so you don't really know what's not coming across properly. My second point would probably be to embrace your platform and not be afraid to ask guests to come on, because if you didn't have the opportunity offered to you, there's like, you're just being offered to you for a reason. You're definitely worthy of what is being put on your plate, and if you have the capacity, you should embrace it and definitely go forward with it in a way that feels good, in a way that you could put something out into the world that feels like, yeah, I want my mom to listen to this all the time. At least that's how I approached it. And since I picked up unceded airwaves and the Indigenous Collective from other folks who have passed it down, a couple generations of hosts, don't be afraid to make it your own. That is what the previous host told me when I was first speaking with them. They said, you don't have to do what I did just because it's the same name or because someone else next to you is doing a show this way. Do it in a way that makes sense to you and makes sense to what your guests are doing. One episode will never sound the exact same to another episode, but it should still be something that feels very personalized, because people are tuning in for the content, but they're also tuning in for your vibe and for what you're kind of giving to them. You're like, yeah, it's not just for you, but it's for other people, but make sure you feel good about it in the end, because it's your show. Might as well have fun with it so other folks can have fun listening to it. And those are my 3 things.
Awesome. I agree. People are tuning in for your vibe as well. So that's important. The vibe check. For sure. Yeah, that's a good point you brought up, Kleo, of embracing your platform, because that sometimes folks can tiptoe around. And you don't have to. It's a privilege to be able to have a show and have that platform and be confident and just own it. And this is it. You're doing it. Your voice matters. And yeah. So for our next question under making that darn show is 3 don'ts. There are always so many don'ts. Like, talk to anybody who's been running their or doing their podcast or show for a long time, and they'll tell you, oh, let me tell you what not to do, which is often more interesting than what to do. So 3 don'ts when making that darn show. I can just start with what I've got. Wow, so many things that I have learned the hard way, but I think that's kind of the best way to learn, at least for me. I have to make the mistakes and then figure it out on my own. But the first one is, don't write like you write. There's often this urge to write beautiful prose and flowery vocab, which is how we write. And it's interesting, there's something about like picking up that pen and putting it to the paper. You just start writing like you write, like you're writing an essay. But that's not radio speak. Write like you speak. And so when you're scripting, read everything. There's so many times when, and I know this because I've been doing audio for a few years now, but sometimes when I'm really like, oh, this sentence is beautiful, and then I read it out, I'm like, oh, I don't talk like that. And so read your script out loud, imagine you're meeting your friend at a coffee shop, and how would you talk to them? My second one would be, don't leave the tech run to the last minute. Don't assume that your guests are well-versed in audio recording, because people are not, which is okay, but you have to leave enough room. Like, I'll tell you, for this meeting, for this workshop, we met 10 minutes before, did a tech run, made sure everybody's internet is okay, and it's smooth sailing, or if you're sharing a presentation, you do that tech run. But the same thing, but with audio, make sure their baby isn't crying, or the dog isn't barking, or the fridge isn't those like killer sounds in the background. And because often people can't hear for it, but once you like develop an audio audio ear, you notice those annoying sounds, and then you can tell them to go to a different space, go to a different room. So yeah, definitely prep your guests, and don't forget to wear headphones, because you'd be able to hear everything, and you need to be able to hear everything, because this has happened with me where I've had great interviews and the audio quality was awful, and that is devastating. You don't want that to happen. So tech run. And then my last one will be the radio voice. Radio voice is a myth. You don't have to sound like Ira Glass. You just need to sound like yourself. But having said that, of course, doing radio for a bit, I have found my voice, if that makes sense. I've developed sort of like how I like to present and how I like to speak, because it is a performance. Like, yeah, be yourself, but you're still performing. And doesn't mean that it's not real. Because lower energy is boring. You don't want to talk like you're talking, I don't know. Just be enthusiastic, sound like you care, because if you don't care, nobody else will. I mean, definitely I've heard podcasts where it's really boring, and I'm like, oh, why is this person gonna just fall asleep on me right now? And emote a range of emotions through your voice, because that's how people are, that's all they have, right? Your voice. And everybody finds their voice cringe, trust me, and you eventually get over it, so it's okay, you'll be fine. I'll pass it on to you, Kleo.
Sure, yeah. Oh my goodness, yeah, tech runs though, I definitely learned that one the hard way a couple times. Definitely had to say, hey, let's check this really quick. Oh, let's redo that first segment, so sorry. But my 3 don'ts, I'm going to start with, don't forget to time out your breaks and look at the clock, especially if you're live, or even if you're pre-recording and you're thinking ahead for your editing. When are you going to do commercial breaks, or when are you going to give you and your guest a second to go get a glass of water? Especially if you're speaking for an hour or an hour plus, you definitely need a moment to collect yourself and like rehydrate, because it's a little bit of effort. And I know that was one of my biggest struggles, is always forgetting, because I do my interviews mainly through Zoom or just in person in the studio, and they kind of go off on tangents. And then all of a sudden we've been speaking for a very long time. And I remember I should have queued up a commercial break for my editing. So now I have to go back and record myself alone and say, hi, we're going to take a quick commercial break. And hi, we're back. We're getting back in the conversation. And it tends to not sound as organic to jump between your main audio and then those little blips you have to create afterwards. My second don't is, don't be too sad if the conversation you kind of planned out turns into something else. Because sometimes, even if you're in a collective space and you're planning and you're sharing the questions with someone beforehand, when it comes to the moment of you start speaking and organically new ideas come up and stories and little tidbits come up, those things are big pluses. But I know my first few episodes, I was a little stressed when my conversation questions laid out in a certain order had to be flipped around and switched depending on how my guest was speaking with me. Because there are certain times where I wanted to ask a question about what color their hair is, but they already spoke about that before I asked. So now I have to jump around and on the fly figure out what to ask next. That makes sense. But it also turns out to be kind of fun, because as you get more comfortable with speaking and with listening to it back and having those organic conversations recorded, you tend to embrace it a lot more, and you tend to become a lot more relaxed in that space. And my third don't forget to laugh and have fun with it. Like genuinely, like Hina had brought up, like where you kind of write the way you write when you're speaking in a way that you're like, we're formal, we're presenting. No, you're still having a conversation and people are going to make some jokes and you're going to want to laugh. And your listeners are going to want to laugh when you make a joke too. So you might as well laugh with them or prompt them to, like those little applaud signs. At least that's how I tend to think about it. But yeah, make sure you're having fun with it. Radio and these conversations, and even if you're just doing a music show, it should be fun and it should be enjoyable. Because if you're passionate about it, you should still have those good vibes from it. Yeah, and those are my three don'ts. I'll pass it off to Randi.
Hello. So yeah, my three don'ts are also simultaneously things I learned the hard way. So the first one is don't over edit. You do not have to edit out every and that's how people talk. It's natural. If you try to edit out every single one, you will never create another radio show in your life. Number two is don't like overshoot your topics. Be narrow and accept that it has to be narrow. So for intersections, we accept that basically every episode is like an intro to the topic. We only have 90 minutes, which is really only 80 minutes. And you can't cover everything in that 80 minutes. So just, approach what you can and acknowledge that there's always more to learn. And the last one, which is very much from my own experience, is don't set deadlines that you can't meet. If you are like me, where I really need deadlines to like hold myself accountable, that's great, but make sure that they're like actually achievable, which in radio, it fluctuates. Like if you're planning, like I'm working on a limited series right now, I've been working on it for over 2 years. I initially planned to have it done in 6 months. So I think that something is just like being kind to yourself and going back to what Kleo said, have fun. Radio is fun. It's supposed to be, a good way to meet people, have conversations. So make sure that you're both holding yourself accountable, but also being kind to yourself. Yeah, those are my three things.
Love it. Yeah, no, for sure. I echo what you both said about having fun and just reminding yourself why you started this in the first place, because you don't want to, once you burn out and it's not bringing you joy, then that really sucks and you're going to not want to do a show ever again, like Randi said. And so definitely self-compassion. And projects take longer than you expect, and that's okay. If you didn't get it done in 2 months, you'll get it done in 6 months, and that's fine. Okay, so for our last, we might just have maybe time for one last prompt. And that is, if you take away one thing from this workshop, what is that? And I am going to pass it on to Randi first.
Okay, so very quickly, this is again based on my own experience. Spend your time planning. Again, not going to give too much away, but this limited series I've been working on, I did interviews before I had scripted episodes. Don't do that. I mean, obviously there's fluctuation in like, working with a schedule, but definitely the more effort you put into planning, it's just like if you're writing an essay, the more effort you put into your outline for your essay, the easier it will be to write the essay. And yeah, that's like my number one thing. If you put the time into planning, shows don't happen overnight. Be clear in your attention for your show. All of those things will make it out easier once you start to actually move forward with either doing your show pre-recorded, whatever format you're doing. The more planning you have, the easier it'll be. Yeah, and I'll pass it off to Kleo.
Thank you. I think my big takeaway that I'm hoping folks are kind of getting is that your ideas and creativity are unique and valuable. You are capable of doing anything that you feel should exist in the world, as long as you're popping off respectfully. Because also, depending on your audience, you gotta make sure you're like keeping people in mind. Because even if you feel really good about something, I think of how it might be received. But if you're thinking about it and you think that you'd be someone that would listen to what you want to create, that's at least one listener, even if it's just yourself. So I think folks should definitely feel the confidence to go and pursue a creative endeavor like radio or podcasting. It's a lot of fun and you get to learn along the way, and it's a whole experience, which is fantastic. And I'll pass it off to Hina.
Great. I'll just quickly say my one takeaway for folks who are listening. And this is, as most of my coworkers know, the hill I'm going to die on is informed banter. I feel like there tends to be an assumption that radio doesn't warrant as much research, or an interview style podcast can be casual and friendly. And yes, it should be all those things. But that doesn't mean that preparation does not go into it. And people, again, often feel that you'll go on air and you speak impromptu, but to get that impromptu, casual, loose style, you have to do a lot of preparation. There's nothing wrong, again, with off-the-cuff style, but again, research and preparation is still crucial, because ultimately you should respect your listeners and their time. Make sure to fact check your content, and in case you have doubts, say that, as Randi mentioned previously, when they don't know anything or their volunteers don't know anything, they say that. And informed banter at the end of the day is not only necessary, but I believe it significantly improves the quality of your show. People view you as credible, and it makes it much easier for listeners to trust you if they know that they can rely on the information that you're presenting.